So we have this once a week class where we learn a sicha from the Rebbe on the storyline of the Chumash. This is what's going on. What we've learned is, if I may use generalizations and paraphrase, Moshe comes out of nowhere to redeem the Jews. Moshe comes out of nowhere to redeem the Jewish people. And of course, the most surprised person of all is Moshe himself. Why would Hashem send a novice? Jews have been suffering for decades. And who bled with them? Who bled with them? Aaron and Miriam. And they're not good enough. Somebody who's completely above the suffering has to redeem them. And we discussed why it has to be that way. Because if you're a part of the suffering, you can't be part of the redemption. You can't relate to freedom, to flying, to use the illusion from the earlier class. So Aaron comes out of nowhere. Moshe comes out of nowhere. Moshe, of course, doesn't think he's worthy, and he also is very concerned about jealousy. And the Eibusha says, I'll decide who's worthy, and as far as jealousy is concerned, just go see your brother and watch him respond to the discovery that he's the Shamish and you're the Rebbe. He's going to be thrilled, and very happy, which is, of course, what happens. And Moshe returns to Mitzrayim, and the negotiations begin. And of course, the first thing that happens when Moshe returns to Mitzrayim and the negotiations begin is that, very, very predictably, bad turns to worse. And it's upsetting Moshe Rabbeinu very much. He protests. The Eibishter puts him in his place. Then starts a whole nother negotiations. Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Eibishter a second time after discussing it in last week's Pasha also, how can I speak to the Pharaoh? Remember? I am kvad peh ukvad loshen, it's hard for me to speak. And then as he ages, interestingly enough, he says, Amar al Sfasayim, I can't talk at all. So the Eibishter tells him, you are going to speak to Pare for me. Nesaticha lekim lefara. You are to the Pharaoh like a lekim. Va'aran achicha yir niviyecha. Your brother Aaron is going to be your spokesperson, your prophet, your communicator, your vehicle of communication. And we had several classes discussing this notion of two people sharing one job. Historically, and according to Torah, and I read the Rashi with you, which says this explicitly, Daber echad ladoid v'lo yishnei dabar, but the way the Jewish community is devised, there's one leader in a generation. Yeshua says, Moshe says, Yeshua, you will lead with the elders, and the Eibush taps Moshe Rabbeinu on the shoulder and says, tell him he's in charge. There's no assistance. What he says goes. Haka b'kakadim, hit them on their head and make them follow. There's one leader. Here we have an instance of shared leadership. Shared leadership. And the Rebbe discussed this unusual arrangement, why you have shared leadership, how it works, how on the one hand Moshe and Aaron are very much the same because they have the same ancestors and how they're distinct and different. And last week we added another insight. Aaron is the great communicator. Aaron has the skill to talk and to express and to explain and to use a Hebrew term, to be mat'im with a test, to give flavor, to give meaning. A party is going to understand what Aaron says. But Moshe has to say it first. What's the point of a person who could barely put syllables together coherently and in a way that you could understand them speak when there's somebody who's such a great speaker? And the answer is because Moshe's words have the power of God. Aaron's don't. So Moshe says it once, doesn't matter if Pari understands or not. Elikim is in those words and then Pari is matter. This was last week's class. So we've set the stage. The Redeemer has arrived. The collaboration has been established. And now we get to the actual meeting. Moshe and Aaron are going to meet the Pharaoh. And of course we all know the story. Moshe and Aaron go to meet the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh is uncooperative. Right? He's not impressed. Moshe performs a miracle, Aaron, the Pharaoh's magicians perform the same. Moshe performs the second miracle, the Pharaoh's magicians perform the same. Over and over again. He's not impressed. What comes next What comes next? Somebody help me out, please. Anybody?
If there was a thing that creates, like, they can't do it, doesn't need to do a miracle.
The Makkos. The plagues. The Makkos. Try it. Can you do this? Okay, now can you do this? Blood, frogs, and so on. So the meetings between Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron HaKohen and the Pharaoh played themselves out over a year, maybe a little more than a year and a half. We're not sure exactly how much time. And they were negotiation. But they're an interesting kind of negotiation. Usually negotiations are about compromise, right? In this case, negotiation is about no compromise. I'm going to squeeze you and squeeze you and squeeze you until I get 100% of what I want. And that's the story. Right? Yes. Moshe comes to the Pharaoh, he says, okay, I'll give you 10%. No, I need the other 90%. I'm not giving you. So he squeezes him. I'm makkeh. Okay, I'll give you 20%. No, you give me 100%. No, I'm only, okay, squeezes him some more. Tightens the screws and tightens the screws and tightens the screws and tightens until the Pharaoh says, gig isn't today. Get out of here. Right? That's the story of the Chumash, the Makkos. The Makkos follow the initial meeting between Moshe Rabbeinu and the Pharaoh. During these meetings, the Pharaoh shows his hard-headedness, and Moshe Rabbeinu demonstrates how, as a shliach of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he can make that hard head hurt. Seriously. And this is what unfolds. In other words, the next series of classes are going to be Sichos, not describing Moshe's relation with the Eibishter, not describing Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron HaKohen's collaboration and leadership, but their meetings with the Pharaoh. They meet the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh is not behaving, and this happens. They teach him a thing or two, to put it in plain English. Okay? So we're going to learn a number of Sichos that are going to describe the meetings. I'm still in the planning stages. I have another folder where I keep my Sichos folder, and I anticipate what Sichos I want to teach you. One of the questions that I have in my mind is, should we study each of the Makkos? There's at least one Sicha on each of the Makkos. Usually they're Rashi Sichos, but even in a Rashi Sicha there's enough Chasidus to bring out the neshama of each one of the Makkos. If I know me, I'll probably do it because I'm an expert foot dragger, if there is such a thing. But I'm still undecided. In the meantime, what we're starting today is a new stage in the story of the Exodus. Moshe and Aaron meet the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh is uncooperative, and they make life difficult for him. This is what we're going to be learning about. Okay? Now, how does the story go? So first of all, I want to repeat something, which I mentioned in an earlier class, and it's a Zohar originally. The Rabbi brings it in the Zohar, and I've talked about it a lot. I think the Even HaEzer makes a big deal of it. That if you study the story, you see a pattern. Moshe Rabbeinu met the Pharaoh under three circumstances. He met him by the river. He met him, we don't know where, and he met him in the palace. And we don't know where means exactly that. It wasn't by the river, it wasn't the palace. I don't know, met him in the market. It doesn't specify where. And this cycle of meeting him by the river, and then meeting him we don't know where, and then meeting him in the palace, repeats itself three times. Dam Tzvadei Kinim. Dam was by the river. Tzvadei doesn't say where. And Kinim is in the palace. And the same is true as David, Arav, Shchin, and then Borad, Arbe, Choshech. It's a series of threes. And the Zohar says that Moshe had no problem meeting him by the river. Moshe didn't have such a problem meeting him, I don't know where. But Moshe was actually afraid to meet him in the palace. Because the palace represented his spiritual power, not just his actual power, his mystical power, all the forces of evil that the Pharaoh carried. And if you know the Kabbalah, Moshe's Chochmah and Pais Keser of Klippa wasn't simple. Moshe is afraid to meet him in the palace, which is why each time he goes into the palace, it says the word boy. What does boy mean? Come with me. It doesn't say lech, it doesn't say go. It says come with me. When he meets him by the river, it says lech. When he meets him in the palace, it says boy. Because Moshe is afraid to go, the Eibush is going to go with him. There is a possibility that we're going to explore this boy in a future class, in the near future. If I don't do it in the near future, we're going to do it in the distant future, but we're going to eventually get to this whole issue that Moshe is meeting the Pharaoh, depending on where he's meeting him, determines how powerful the opponent is. Moshe Rabbeinu's meeting the Pharaoh at the river was wonderful. We had a very interesting and entertaining class about going down to the river and meeting the Pharaoh who's trying to convince people that he's a god because he doesn't excrete. And Moshe Rabbeinu basically showed him up in the most, how do we say it, compromising way. But meeting him in the palace was overwhelming to Moshe Rabbeinu. He meets the Pharaoh and the negotiations begin. How do the negotiations begin? We've done this at least twice because it's old stuff. It's from last week's parasha. Moshe Rabbeinu comes into the palace. He walks straight into the antechamber, right straight into the throne room of the king. Now, the fact that Moshe got into Pharaoh's throne room tells him what? That all of his guards, and all of his gatekeepers, and all of his fences, and all of his magic couldn't stop this man. He walked straight through. So before Moshe opens his mouth, Paro recognizes he's dealing with an adversary that has to be respected. Right? Moshe comes to the palace. You read the Midrash Chazal. That palace was full of guards and full of magic and all kinds of forces. You try to walk to that palace, you'd be eaten up alive 5 times on 5 different levels. Moshe marches into the Pharaoh. What about the people standing at the gate who are supposed to decide, who are you? What are you doing? Who let you in? No one let me in. I walked in myself. And they didn't stop you? Fire them. But of course, Moshe Rabbeinu did what he wanted in Paro's palace. So before Moshe opens his mouth, Paro already knows this guy I got to reckon with. This man is formidable. I don't know who he is. I don't know where his powers come from. But if he made it into this room, and none of my guards, and none of my fences, and none of my obstacles stood in his path, this is a powerful man. This is the first thing. The walking into the palace was incredible. It was huge. And then Moshe and Paro begin a conversation. And Moshe Rabbeinu says to Paro, I am a representative of the God of the Jewish people, and I let my people go and they shall serve me. The first request was for 3 days. Imagine Paro let him have the 3 days. What would have happened next? How would the story have gone if Paro said, okay, take him for 3 days and bring him back? Moshe would have kept his word. Yes. So what would have happened next? Okay, the answer is it wouldn't have happened. So the Paro starts to assess his adversary. He starts to size up Moshe Rabbeinu. Who's this guy? Who is he? He ended up in my palace. He ended up in my throne room. He met me by the river. So he's got powers. Just how much power? Who is he? So he starts to talk to Moshe Rabbeinu and says, who do you represent? Which God do you serve? Which God empowers you? And Moshe Rabbeinu says, the God that empowers me's name is Hashem, Havaya, to use a term that's familiar to us. Or if you wanted to be exotic and imprecise, but exotic, Ekya, Aleph Hey, Yud Hey. You may remember that name comes up in last week's Pash. Or Poket, Pokadati. Whatever words Moshe Rabbeinu uses, he tells the Pharaoh who he represents. And Paro says, listen, I've devoted so much of my life to theology. I know so much about gods. The one you just mentioned, never heard of him. How do you spell his name? How do you pronounce his name? Can you do it one more time? So the way this story is told, almost in jest, is that Paro asked, it could be it's a Medrash, they should bring the ledger, the encyclopedia of gods. They had an encyclopedia of gods. So they go and they bring the encyclopedia of gods and they start leafing through the pages. I don't know if it was alphabetical or it was based on the pictures. You have the dove and you have the dragon and you have the snake pictures. How do you organize the pictures? I don't know if you are aware of this, but they recently were able to prove, in the last 150 years, that the pictures and the hieroglyphics of the ancient Egyptian language is actually letters. It's not words, it's letters. And they're able to figure out each picture what letter it represents, and that's why they're able to something called the Rosetta Stone that allows them to read ancient Egyptian. They were able to bring back a dead language because the Rosetta Stone had the same inscription in 4 different languages. One of them was Greek, which we know. And they were able to extrapolate. They could read the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Each picture is not a word, but a letter, an us. So that's interesting. And so they took out this book of pictures, and they looked through it, and the Pharaoh looks up from his bifocals and says, he's not in my book. Moshe says, he doesn't have to be in your book. He has to be in charge of the world. So the Pharaoh says, okay, if I don't know who he is, tell me something about him. So I'm going to paraphrase. I don't want to spend forever on this. Moshe says, he's the God of the supernatural. They're the gods of nature, and there are all kinds of forces in nature. Hot and cold, dry and wet, light and dark. winter and summer, land and sea. There are many gods that represent various forces of nature. This is the God of the supernatural, and he encompasses all of nature. So the Pharaoh says Meshman as follows. I have a book full of gods. At the very back of the book there is a supplement, there is an addition. And they mention a God whose name is Elokim. And it's suggested this Elokim is the God of nature, which means he encompasses all of the gods of nature in one. I'm not sure about this God Elokim, but at least it's in the book. Elokim is one God that encompasses all the forces of nature. Instead of having 50 million different gods who encompass this force in nature and this force in nature and that force, there's one God encompasses all. But you've got a God that's above nature. I don't know of such a God. I don't believe such a thing is possible. So I think you're an impostor. You represent nobody, and I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not letting the Jewish people go. So Moshe Rabbeinu is now in the process of giving the Pharaoh an education. And the education is, he may not be written in the book, but believe me, you're going to have this book updated. You're going to publish a new edition, and he's going to be in the front page, in the middle page, in the back page, and every page in between. And this is the story of the Makkos. The story of the meetings of Moshe Rabbeinu and the Pharaoh over and over and over again is Parei resisting what Moshe is saying. Not only because this was economic, this was business, and the Jews were slaves, and such an important part of it, there was a slave-based economy. And the Jews leave, the whole economy collapses. But there was also a theological, a very, very serious spiritual component to it all. Parei resisted because he refused to believe. Parei was a very religious man. In other words, he was a very superstitious man. He was full of all kinds of fears. But there were certain things he didn't fear because he couldn't imagine them. One of the things he did not fear because he couldn't imagine it is a miracle. So Moshe showed him one, and another, and another, and another, and another, and another, and another. And he convinced him. But he didn't convince him because he did a lot of miracles. He convinced him because the miracles that he did kind of hurt, if you know what I mean. They weren't just miracles, ta-da, made a tissue turn to gold. There were miracles where all of a sudden your skin is crawling with insects. Those kind of miracles, you understand? And eventually the Father succumbs, and lets the Jewish people go. So there's a story here. There's a story. The meeting between Moshe and the Pharaoh is a story. It's not just something that happens. There's a whole, we're using the word negotiations because it's a modern term, but it's an ongoing wearing down of the Pharaoh until he says, okay, whatever you want, you can have. Just take it and go. Whatever you want, take it. I forgot even the conditions. Just take it and go. I don't want to deal with you anymore. But that doesn't happen until Parshas Boy. That doesn't happen until Makkos B'Chodesh, the 10th of the 10 plagues. And between the beginning of the story and the end of the story, Pharaoh witnesses many, many miracles, including miracles that are very, very personal and very, very uncomfortable and very hurtful. And he's worn down. And there's another factor, which is fascinating. And the additional factor is that it says in Chumash, the Rambam brings this up in Hilchos Tshuva. The Rambam has 2 chapters in Hilchos Tshuva where he talks about free will. And in the second chapter where he talks about free will, he raises this issue. When Moshe comes to the Pharaoh the first time, the Pharaoh is in full glory. He's powerful, he's arrogant, he's self-assured, he's a god, even in his own mind. Every time Moshe Rabbeinu meets him, he's a little more beaten up. But he's so stubborn. The Hebrew words to connote the stubbornness of the Pharaoh is hachbadat halev, kaved lev, a heavy heart, a hard heart. So the Torah tells us an interesting little detail. And the detail is that for the first 5 plagues, for the first 5 Makkos, Parei was resistant. Parei had a hard heart, and he would not let the Jewish people go. Beginning with the 6th Makkah, Parei did not have any more koyach to resist. He was worn out. But he resisted anyway. Why? And one of the most strange details in the story of the Exodus. Va'ani achbid eslev Parei. I am going to harden the heart of the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh is worn out. He has enough. It's enough. And the Eibishter stubbornizes him. The Eibishter makes him more stubborn than he naturally was, which is so interesting. The whole point of negotiating with the Pharaoh, the whole point of twisting his arm, the whole point of giving him Makkos is because he was not letting the Jewish people go. Now he's ready, and the Eibishter says, "Oh, I'm going to make sure he doesn't do it." Now, what's that about? The whole issue was he wasn't buying in. Now you're going to squeeze him more just for the fun of it? He's ready to let him go. You're not going to let him do it by making him unnaturally stubborn and suffer 5 more plagues. The Rambam asks this question. But he asks this question in the scheme of free will. What kind of free will is it? You take a person's free will away from him and punish him for the choices you made for him? And the Rambam gives a very down-to-earth, logical answer, which is also very, very disturbing. Disturbing because some of us, how shall I say this, can relate to this personally, if you know what I mean. The answer that the Rambam gives is this. When a person does sin, there's a consequence, there's a punishment. Now you can understand punishment in 2 ways. Punishment can be understood as vengeance, and punishment can be understood as cleansing and refining. We're not going to go into that question. When you do something wrong, to be punished, to be cleansed and refined, and to be avenged. Yeah? Sometimes the person does so many bad things that he deserves a very great punishment. Such a great punishment that in order to earn that punishment, he needs to do a few more bad things. So the Eibishter takes away his free will, has him do additional sin, and punishes him for all of them. Why? Because he earned the punishment which requires more sin. So if he earned the punishment which requires more sin, the punishment has come before the sin. So his will is taken away, he should commit the sin, so the punishment should happen. And that's how the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva, where he discusses free will, answers this question. The second set of 5 plagues, the Pharaoh was acting like a machine. He didn't have free will. The Eibishter took his free will from him. Why? He wanted to punish him for crimes he hadn't committed. Now, how do you punish a person for crimes he hadn't committed? The answer is the crimes that he committed were so great that he deserved more punishment than for the crimes themselves. And therefore, Hashem took away his free will. He did additional sin. Without free will, it was punished for those also because of the sins he did when he still had the free will. That's what Rambam says. It's a very interesting interpretation. So this is part of the narrative, part of the story. Moshe is negotiating with the Pharaoh. He's wearing the Pharaoh down. He's wearing him down. He's beating him up. And all of us know the story. It's written in the Chumash, it's explained in Madrash Chazal, that the Pharaoh doesn't believe. I believe in God. I believe in many gods. But the God of the supernatural, God of miracles, doesn't exist. And he sees one miracle and a second miracle. He's in denial. My magicians can do it too. My magicians can do it. Okay, this one they couldn't do, but it's only one. Kenan, as you mentioned. And it's wearing the Pharaoh down. It's exhausting the Pharaoh. It's punishing the Pharaoh to let the Jewish people go. Here is a sikh that adds a new dimension to the story. In fact, the sikh adds 2 additional dimensions to the story. We don't have time to learn the Sikha because I have to let you go on time today. So today's class will be considered introductory. I'm going to tell you what happens in the Sikha. And this is it's really an important Sikha. It's a very important Sikha from a religious perspective, from our perspective, from a theological perspective. There are 2 points the Rebbe makes in the Sikha. The first, the Rebbe really borrows from the Abarbanel. In other words, the Rebbe simply quotes what the Abarbanel says, I agree, sort of. The second point is the Rebbe's creative original point. And the 2 points are, it's true. God punished the Pharaoh. He gave him miracles. He gave him plagues. So he should let the Jewish people go. But there is something educational going on here. The Eibishter, while he's doing all these terrible things to the Pharaoh to let the Jewish people go, is trying to get the Pharaoh to come to know God. It's not just about punishment. It's not just about extracting the Jews from the non-Jews. It's not just about getting even with the Pharaoh. There is a serious element of education. Hashem is teaching the Pharaoh, and through the Pharaoh he's bringing to the whole world God. Very important part of the story. That he's not only getting the Pharaoh out of the way, he's educating the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh's going to be destroyed. His kingdom is going to be destroyed. His army is going to be wiped out. His weapons are going to be drowned in the sea. But he's going to become educated. And the education which is given to the Pharaoh is not only a personal education to that individual person, it's a precedent for educating the world about God. And then this Sikha has a trick, has a little bit of a twist. And the twist is that even when God is wearing down the Pharaoh, that's level 1. Even when God is educating the Pharaoh, that's level 2. There's a level 3. And the level 3 is there is something in this also for the Jewish people. When the Eibishter wears down the Pharaoh, it's not only so the Pharaoh should let the Jewish people go. It's so that something should be gained by the Pharaoh in terms of education, and something should be gained by the Jewish people also in terms of education, in addition to the freedoms they're going to have. And we shall do this next Wednesday, BLN. Questions or comments? Okay, I'll see you then.